Hi, welcome to the session on how CISA is charting a path towards defensible infrastructure. I'm Sunil Yu, and I'm the creator of the Cyber Defense Matrix, and I used to be the Chief Security Scientist at Bank of America. As we go through our session today, through the magic of virtual conferences, we can multitask as we're talking and interact with you. So if you have any questions as we go through the session, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll be happy to answer some of the questions that you might have very interactively as we're talking and giving our presentation. Um, I'm co-presenting with my friend Josh Corman, so let me turn over to him to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Josh Corman. I wear a lot of hats. One is the founder of IamTheCavalry.org and RuggedSoftware.org. But today, I'm serving as the chief strategist for CISA for the pandemic response for healthcare and COVID-19 related activities. And it is through this 1 year CARES Act post to help with the pandemic where I learned of Sunil's project to help make CISA stronger for the future. And of course, I had to be positively disruptive by bringing to bear some of the defensible infrastructure and rugged and cavalry concepts to maybe make sure that we're doing the right things the right way to really take a leap forward and hopefully take, if you're familiar with my work, some of this will be a little review. If you're familiar with his, some of that will be a little bit of a review. But on the next slide, you'll see we want to take my chocolate and Sunil's peanut butter and have two great tastes that taste great together in the form of national security and cyber defense peanut butter cups of a sort. So this is a bit of taking two things that were developed for completely different reasons in the private sector and through the crucible of national security, whether it's the defense of federal agencies or, as we saw during the pandemic, the increased brazen activity of cyber criminals to attack critical infrastructure and undermine our national critical functions, including the delivery of healthcare or drinkable water or power and utilities. So as the world is increasingly dependent on critical infrastructure, it needs to be dependable. So we're going to show a play in 3 acts of some prior work from myself, some prior effort from Sunil within the context of CISA and how we put our heads together and turn things on their head, hopefully in a way that while developed for CISA will be very relevant to your day job and for application in your environment. So let's start with some of this, the primitives that became disruptive later. Way too many years ago, I was at an RSA conference party with a few people, and I was railing about how we were going to reinvent the application security market to make everything that the infrastructure security market made. And we pulled up the Agile manifesto and realized that there's no mention of threat or adversary or risk or security. And I said, we need a pathos. We need some sort of value set that developers understand the awesome responsibility that comes with writing digital infrastructure. Because as you know, the world is increasingly depending on that digital infrastructure. So this very short, rugged manifesto with lines like, I recognize my code will be used in ways I cannot anticipate, in ways it was not designed, and for longer than it was ever intended. We meant that at the time, but boy, does it feel different right now when we're having unsupported software possibly affecting public safety, human life, or national security. So that rugged concept really found its footing later. Gene Kim and I showed this, I think it was at RSA 2011, 10 years ago, to combine rugged with a new cultural change within the software community, because we can't push security on them. So we wanted them to want to be rugged, to want to be mean to their code, to have some shared value set. And the rugged DevOps movement is now matriculated into DevSecOps and the like. Some of those concepts as well turned into product security things that have been pushing things like, I think 1 year RSA asked me to do a Pachachka talk about why zombies love PCI. And initially as a joke, but now it's foundational to the CMU courses I teach for the CISO program, was I made this zombie survival pyramid of it's not security that keeps you alive during the zombie apocalypse. It's other things are much more important. And just like a food guide pyramid, we're ignoring the really important things at the bottom. So the concept here was if you're going to survive a zombie apocalypse, it's not the security you buy, but how defensible your IT and infrastructure is. Do you run towards a wooden barn that's falling apart or towards a brick building that can be defended? It's also not security to say, do you keep your wits around you, about you, and do your fellow survivors act as a cohesive unit? Do you know what you have? Do you know when it changes? Do you act in a disciplined and organized way to operate that infrastructure? Are you fighting in the dark? Are you fighting blindly but dying quickly? So we lack situational awareness and we're really poorly instrumented often. So we're fighting blindly and dying quickly. But we keep buying all these blinky boxes and $80 billion plus of cybersecurity countermeasures without really an operational context. And I was really trying to push that we need defensible IT that's well owned and operated, well instrumented, and then we can bring the right tools to bear. And this should be the order of operations that we anticipate. Again, meant for IT, but click ahead. And it started to become very real. 8 years ago, I started IamTheCavalry.org, and that was in recognition that our dependence on connected technology was now coming into safety critical national security areas. And that software is not nearly dependable enough. So the Cavalry was a volunteer movement saying, if the cavalry isn't coming, what will you do to be part of that solution to drive software defensibility and safety primitives into connected digital infrastructure wherever bits and bytes meet flesh and blood? This could be your cars, it could be your medical devices, it could be your hospital's successful operations during a pandemic, the ability to trust the water supply from contamination, reliable power. So we are in a place where we have not yet driven in defensibility and survivability and resilience and other safety measures into this. And this has ultimately led my journey into CISA to try to help during the pandemic. So at the time, we tried to articulate what are the qualities, the IDIs of rugged and rugged DevOps. And these are really design points or first principles for software developers. And they include what you can read here: supportability, flexibility, resilience, recoverability, longevity. And they were reflected in many of the words and phrases of that manifesto. What got a little bit less, as Sunil scoured the internet for writings on this, is I didn't write as much, but I spoke an awful lot about the next principle, which was really, let's define defensibility. What did I mean there? And there's a number of ways you could objectively try to index and measure this. But think of it like this: what's more defensible, that wooden barn or that brick school building? What's more defensible, a mandatory access control architecture or discretionary access control architecture? An iOS or an Android OS? What's more defensible, something with 10 ports and services open just in case you might need them, or something that has the 3 ports and services you actually need? And without being comprehensive, this is things like reducing elective risk, elective attack surface, elective complexity. Do you really need it? Or do you need a general purpose device or a fit for purpose hardened device? These were taking shift left from a slogan and into an actual set of practices. And these were security design requirements, architecture design reviews, threat modeling, not after you've already written something that cannot be defended, but designing in trust boundaries, concepts of least privilege, extra instrumentation, additional separation and segregation of duties in the code and in the architecture. And then also, since all software will have flaws no matter how good a job you do you have the programs and attestations of program support to demonstrate that you are trustworthy? Do you have a published software development lifecycle and security program? Do you have coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs inviting good faith actors to report issues to you without fear of legal reprisals? Do you have SBOMs or software bill of materials to advertise the transparency of the software building blocks that you use, and that you're using only the freshest of ingredients and respond quickly with patches when required? And you make contractual commitments to offer patches for some minimum lifespan within some reasonable duration. And this is not comprehensive, but these become some of the things that where one could measure the relative defensibility of A versus B versus C. And sadly, we've kind of gotten this upside down, and we're a bit upside down on our mortgage, because by skipping defensible infrastructure, we have an inability to operate it. If you don't know what normal is, how can you know what abnormal is? The concepts of things such as so simple as anomaly detection are predicated on the assumption that you know what normal looks like. And too often, these indefensible architectures are chaotically owned and operated. We tend not to instrument them very well, or even if we did, we wouldn't be able to spot the signal and the noise. So therefore, we have to compensate with confidentiality, integrity, and availability countermeasures, a strategy of the past on less defensible infrastructure. And it just makes me wonder sometimes if there's any right way to do the wrong thing. And I continue to think we're completely upside down in our thinking and upside down in our approach in our mortgage. And my hope, and through other talks at RSA, have been getting outside of your sphere of control where you can buy countermeasures down to your sphere of influence, where you can partner with key teammates like the CIO or like the vice president of engineering, so that we can drive some of this down into more defensible IT choices in the first place. Now, ultimately, in CISA parlance, we have a current state, whether it was ideal or not, and our job is to defend today. But another half of that mission is to secure tomorrow, which may mean buying more security and deploying more security services. It may also mean changing the game and pushing harder on making sure the IT choices we make are defensible in the first place, and that we then do a good job doing so. Now, as I said before, the current strategies for defend today are unfortunately upside down. And as such, a lot of the market and even government response may include some of that historical thinking. And CISA has a service catalog initially developed for helping to protect our federal agencies across the federal government, but it's also applied to help increasingly to help defend privately owned and operated critical infrastructure, such as hospitals, power plants, dams, pipelines, and the like. And if we need a better digital infrastructure, it's going to start with thinking a bit bigger and a bit differently.
So this is when I come into the picture. I had the opportunity last year to develop what we call the CISA stack. Back in April 2020, the GSA formally designated CISA as the Cyber Quality Service Management Office, or CUSMO. And the Cyber CUSMO is supposed to be this single shared office for managing various cybersecurity solutions for the US government and potentially beyond to include critical infrastructures. The Cyber CUSMO is intended to centralize, standardize, and offer just a wide range of high quality services and capabilities to CISA's customers and to provide whatever integration and adoption support it might need. The efforts to basically standardize this and automate the activities would hopefully reduce the operations and maintenance costs for CISA's customers. You get some sort of maybe bulk discount or the ability to do volume buys. Now we have the CISA services catalog that Josh mentioned, but what should be offered by the CUSMO? What, if any, gaps are needing to be filled? Well, if you look at the existing cybersecurity marketplace, you get a bunch of buzzwords, and it's hard to figure out of all these buzzwords if there's anything that's missing. How do you find gaps and opportunities for the CUSMO? So what we need is something that will help us systematically organize all these capabilities and understand what those gaps are. So this led to the CISA Stack initiative, which initially had the goal to basically define and execute a framework-driven methodology that enables agencies to quickly understand their current posture, the range of available technology options for strengthening that posture, and then understanding what those trade-offs might be towards moving to a more robust posture. To facilitate and coordinate our understanding across multiple stakeholders, we needed this common framework to be able to understand where all these different things fit together. And so the cyber defense matrix, which is something that I created when I was at Bank of America, served as this common framework. It served as this bridge across stakeholders. This framework served as a foundation for this methodology and provided a easily understandable organizing structure that would enable agencies to systematically and methodically process all this information and capture it and organize it in such a way that we can quickly understand where the gaps are. So taking all those buzzwords that we saw previously, I can now organize it in accordance with the matrix, and we can see how the systematic structure helps us more easily determine where the gaps and opportunities are as well. So my charter was to then leverage the cyber defense matrix to organize the CISA services catalog into the matrix, and then ultimately find potential gaps. So here we have a quick depiction of some of the capabilities that you see within CISA's portfolio. And then ultimately what we want to do is be able to determine how the vendor marketplace might be able to satisfy some of these needs that are unaddressed in the CISA portfolio. These commercial products would then be what would be considered for the CUSMO. But we also recognize that not all these capabilities were suitable or necessary for each of the agencies. different constituents will have different requirements, different needs, and different constraints. And so we needed a way to systematically capture all these other bits of data as well. So went back to the drawing board and revised the notion. I revised the notion of what the CISA stack is, and I incorporated a few more layers. So to match the profile for each agency, I needed to capture other characteristics and ultimately map each of those characteristics back to the cyber defense matrix, because the cyber defense matrix then serves as this Rosetta Stone, this mapping that allows us to see and produce this holistic view across an agency's needs. Now, these layers are a little bit easier to understand if I can compare it using a food analogy, so bear with me as I go through the explanation of each of these layers. So the first layer represents recipes. These are best practices, these are requirements that are defined through reference architectures or compliance frameworks. The second layer represents the pantry, or what you have in your current set of existing technological capabilities. By the way, and as we map some of these capabilities to the matrix, we can then look longitudinally across multiple agencies to see if there's common technology capabilities across multiple organizations. The third layer represents the grocery store. So this layer captures the technological capabilities that are available in the commercial market. And it can also include capabilities that are under development by academia or R&D. The fourth layer represents allergies, and this captures essentially whatever factors may limit an organization's ability to implement a security control. And these constraints may come from mission needs or business needs, or they may come as a result of technological disruption, any number of different reasons for these allergies or constraints. The fifth layer represents nutritional needs. So this layer represents essentially the agency's risk environment, what their threat environment looks like, what are common attack patterns, what areas are most often under attack. And what we want to do is map this risk environment to the cyber defense matrix to then be able to map it across all these layers. And so the combination of these layers creates what I now call the CISA stack. And the combination of these layers allows us to quickly assess the profile of a given agency and understand its needs. And then one of the other core goals that we had in the CISA stack effort was reusability. So several of these layers will likely serve as a reusable building block that other organizations can leverage if they have similar architectures or they have similar threats or share similar constraints. And ultimately, the various combination of these building blocks will help organizations quickly understand the range of options available to secure their organization in a way that will mitigate whatever threats they're facing, while still adhering to whatever constraints and requirements that they have to comply with. So bringing each of these different layers together, what we want to do again is map them to the cyber defense matrix. And in doing so, we can then answer three specific questions. First, we want to be able to understand how secure an agency is. And so we want to map the existing set of capabilities that they have in their pantry. Next, we want to understand how secure they should be. So this is where we take in requirements, but also characterize the risk environment with whatever threats they may be facing and capture that also in the matrix. And then lastly, we want to understand what's available in the marketplace and whatever constraints they have to face. And ultimately, the combination of these layers helps us answer key questions that we might have around where the agency is today, where it needs to be, and ultimately how it can get there. The combination of these layers then provides this consolidated view. And this consolidated view helps us understand the range of options that are available to improve the security posture of the agency. Each overlapping layer describes various risk management considerations and trade-offs, low-hanging fruit, opportunities to innovate, anyway, and different ways that we can think about how we deal with the constraints. For the areas where we don't have constraints, then the decision's probably very easy. It might just be an opportunity to just implement a certain set of controls that already exist in the market. But more often than not, we're going to have constraints. And where we have constraints and an active threat, we have to make a risk management decision because with the right set of stakeholders, because whatever control we might put in may cause some sort of business impact. It may impact the business, it may impact the mission of the organization.
I do not like constraints.
Neither do I, but this is where I think the opportunity to bring together chocolate and peanut butter came about because we've had a series of meetings throughout the summer last year where we were going through this methodology, seeing how it might work with potential agencies that want to give this a try. Um, and along the way, Josh asked very good and disruptive questions like the one that we are teeing up here.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we have constraints, we always do, but I just felt it was wildly unfair and past due. Like, why can't we give constraints to our adversaries? Again, we keep fighting in theory with the home field advantage, but we keep failing to leverage that home field advantage. And I wanted to stick it to the adversaries, cause them to be constrained, force their movements from uncontested space where we can't fight them, maybe toward contested space, maybe like the Battle of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, and the Battle of the 300. Uh, this is CISA. So I wanted to take the fight to them and realized perhaps we're trying to defend indefensible things, and maybe I should dust off some of those old pyramids. And I want to see what Sunil thought.
And so as you shared that, and by the way, I'm not sure if you can tell on the for the viewers, but that there's a remarkable semblance between what Josh looks like today and what King Leonidas looked like thousands of years ago. Anyway, um, so as Josh asked this question, why can't we have constraints for the adversary? It dawned upon me that there was this other framework that I created called the DIE triad. And I believe that the DIE triad was how we can add adversary constraints. So let me now explain what the DIE triad is. So DIE stands for distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. And each of these qualities provides some degree of security value. But Josh mentioned earlier, when it comes to indefensible infrastructure, we have to deal with all these different problems and challenges. But it turns out if you build towards DIE, some of those challenges are easily addressed. So, for example, on the in the context of distributed, if you have a distributed attack, one of the best ways to address it is through a distributed service. Earlier, Josh also mentioned it's hard to tell what's normal, but if things are immutable, then any change is abnormal. So it's easier to find, be able to discover intrusions and unusual anomalies. And then lastly, ephemeral. So one of the things that attackers often want to do is to establish persistence, but if things are ephemeral, then it's kind of hard to maintain that persistence. But what's also interesting is that the more we design towards DIE, the less of a burden that we have towards CIA. In other words, if we can have our assets DIE, then why do we need to CIA them? And one of the things that helps us understand this, to understand this construct a little bit better, it also helps us to re-examine the risk analysis equation. Um, Oftentimes, when we consider how we calculate risk, it's a product of likelihood times impact. Well, what's likelihood made up of? It's made up of two factors. One is vulnerabilities, and unfortunately, it seems like we have a never-ending stream of severe vulnerabilities. You can have everything patched today, and guess what's going to happen tomorrow? You're going to have yet another vulnerability to patch. Um, and then you have a set of never-ending threats, and good luck trying to address those or get rid of those. And we have a situation where vulnerabilities, I will quote Josh here, vulnerabilities age like milk and threats age like wine. And so the combination of the two means that likelihood just continues to increase. What we do with the CIA triad is to try to reduce likelihood. But I would argue that's a losing battle. The opportunity that we have to add adversary constraints or to be able to change the balance of the equation here is to control impact. And I believe the DIE triad is a way to do that. To use another analogy, one that has been fully embraced by many cloud native practitioners, it's the notion of pets and cattle. And if you're not familiar with it, let me quickly explain. So pets are things that you give it a name, and when it gets sick, you take it to the vet, and you like giving it hugs. And when we think about how we used to build systems before the cloud, we used to build lots of pets. Our machines had names that we can pronounce, and when it had a vulnerability or a problem, we take it to our cyber veterinarians to patch it and make it better. And we like hugging our machines, and things like our personal laptops and our national ID numbers are pets. Cattle, on the other hand, you brand it with an obscure name that you can't even pronounce, and when it gets sick, well, you just kind of shoot it and you move on. And containers, Lambda functions, credit card numbers that continuously change. These are things like cattle. And when it comes to our pets, we have to CIA them. But when it comes to cattle, we should design them to DIE. And defending indefensible pets is hard enough. I think this challenge is exacerbated by the sheer number of pets that we oftentimes have to deal with. I mean, if you're a pet owner, I'm sure you know there's a lot. It takes a lot of work to take care of a pet. Imagine if you had 10 times that number and they started breeding amongst themselves. I mean, you literally and figuratively have a zoo, right? So moving to indefensible infrastructure may also require us to change how we think about our roles and responsibilities. When we have to deal with pets, our role is to become a cyber veterinarian, and we have to take care of all these pets with tender, loving care. Um, Going forward, we may have, if we're going to try to build towards die, what we want to do is try to avoid unknowingly creating new pets. And we have to basically make sure that anyone who wants to create a pet, they have to sign up for the responsibility to care for that pet, or at least provide the resources to make sure that those pets are properly taken care of. Now, when it comes to adding adversary constraints, DIE enables us to think about how we can build using components that are distributed, immutable, and ephemeral, instead of components that require CIA. Now, normally, as security people, as security practitioners, we have a natural tendency to encourage people to think about security first. I mean, that's kind of our mantra, right? But that's actually not what we want here. Having people think about security first means designing towards CIA. Instead, we want them to design towards DIE first. So let's take, for example, a traditional three-tiered web application. What you see here are all the different attack surfaces and things that you have to defend, the things that you have to CIA in a three-tiered web application. But as we talked about earlier with Josh's description of defensible infrastructure, what we're wanting to do is to remove elective attack surfaces. And so instead of asking, how can we secure this application? What we should be asking is, how can we make it DIE instead? Do we need a network? Can we make a DIE? Do we need a server? Can we make that DIE as well? Well, great. Then let's get rid of those attack surfaces and see what's remaining. Can we make the application or the data become DIE? No? Well, in that case, we need to CIA those particular pets. And so I think this whole notion of looking at DIE is a step function modifier to the defensibility equation. Narrowing paths creates this defensibility. But DIE, I think DIE goes a little bit even beyond that, because it's not the kind of DIE doesn't just narrow the paths that we see going. If we were to use the castle and moat analogy, the moat provides this perimeter, and the drawbridge is this narrow path. The moat creates an opportunity to create adversary constraints by limiting the attack vector. But I think DIE goes further than that, because DIE makes the targets behind those attack vectors less and less impactful if those targets get compromised. So DIE is a different type of constraint. That one that doesn't require, in many cases, a perimeter at all, because what you would otherwise have within the perimeter is already built to and meant to DIE. So let's look at how we can apply some of these toward how we can apply the principle of DIE towards some recent events. And we'll pick out some emergency directives that were issued by CISA. Now, I don't think this was intentional on the part of CISA, but if you look very carefully at the emergency directive, you'll see many elements of the DIE philosophy baked in. So first of all, it says agencies that decide to run the SolarWinds Orion platform. So it gives you an option to say, I choose not to decide, right? So there's this notion that why do you need to even run the Orion's platform? It's because you typically will have an on-premise environment. You have network infrastructure. It's a fixed network environment. And in that fixed network environment, you have to manage it. And so you have SolarWinds to help you do that. But what if you actually move to the cloud where the environment is widely distributed, where there's not a fixed network environment anymore? Do you really need SolarWinds to help you manage that environment? So I think the first step of just even deciding, do you want to go back to pets again, or do you have an opportunity to actually move towards cattle? Inherent in this statement of deciding is the opportunity to say, you know what, we don't need to adopt another pet again. Let's see what we can do to build towards cattle. Next is immutability. So the statement at the bottom talks about following the SolarWinds security configuration hardening guidelines. So if you choose to end up deploying SolarWinds, then one thing that you can do potentially is to create guardrails of immutability that says, here's what this product is supposed to do. And if it violates those parameters, if it violates those behaviors, then set those alarms or fire off those alarms, fire off those alerts. Being able to essentially the way I look at this, immutability provides a way to apply zero trust principles to our supply chain, to our vendors. We don't trust our vendors, we don't trust our supply chain, and so we're going to create these sort of guardrails around what's expected, and anytime it violates those, we set off alarms. And then lastly, when it comes to the ephemeral piece, if you look at the requirements or the recommendations around the hosts, it says that you're going to rebuild these, it should rebuild these hosts. Well, if you have hosts that are physical, then consider moving them to something that's more ephemeral, like a VM. Make them more and more short-lived. If they're already built on VMs, maybe move them to containers. If they're already built on containers, move them to serverless. Ultimately, what we want to try to do is to make these more and more short-lived. And then it also has recommendations around passwords. So multi-factor authentication, that gives you the opportunity to have very short-lived passwords. And then it says if you can't do MFA, then you're going to have a long-lived password, but at the very least, make those long-lived passwords short-lived as much as possible with a 90-day lifetime. And then here's another example in relation to Exchange. Now, you'll have to give me some liberties here to exercise creative license here in the interpretation, but I can also read this directive as follows. So first thing it says, if you have on-premise Exchange, all right, then more than likely your pet is pretty sick. And it's likely to get other things infected, okay? Gain persistent access to other systems in your environment. However, if you happen to be using cattle, then you're fine, okay? If you're on O365, you're good. Now, if you have a sick and dying pet, you need to do something about it. So hopefully you have a cyber veterinarian on staff with the expertise to take action. But if you don't, then you're going to have to put that pet down. And ultimately, you may not have a good day. It might be a bad day when you put your pet down, but at this point, your pet is dying. It's sick. It's dying. It's probably already dead on its deathbed. So if you're going to rebuild, why don't you go ahead and make it cattle instead? So latent in how you can read through some of these directives, you can see how there's this nudge towards moving towards a DIE construct as opposed to having to continually CIA your pets.
So I guess if we're talking about pets and cattle, this is the great puppy massacre of 2021. But it is, for the adversaries, it's like kicking puppies. There's no challenge whatsoever. And I think what's stunning is if you saw Bob Rudis do his data science work on the internet, and he saw that the number one market share for version for Exchange for the whole internet, especially for designated critical infrastructure sectors, were running unsupported versions of Exchange on-prem, unsupported on-prem pets. And I think at some point we talk about defend today, secure tomorrow, but there's a third one, which is build back better. And in that kind of concept of defend today and secure tomorrow, there's an awesome responsibility that comes with having pets. There's an even more profound responsibility when you're in support of designated critical infrastructure or public safety, human lives. And pretty soon, if not already, if we don't learn to look at infrastructure that can DIE, we're going to have people DIE. And we're really hoping that just like these triangles happen to be the symbol of change, that we can embrace some of these recent high profile failures as a reason to change. So we have a current state. We'd like to get to a desired state. Sometimes that's through planning and courage, and sometimes it's through a crisis where we can build back better. And when you have a fork in the road, we're encouraging that you leverage some of these concepts. Again, there is no right way to do the wrong thing. Think about fighting smarter, not harder.
So just to leave you with some thoughts in terms of how you can put this to practice in your own organization. So this was meant to be a proof of concept to demonstrate whether or not we could um, apply some of these principles and concepts towards the problems that we saw or some of the challenges that we saw with CISA. But we think it has broader applicability outside of just CISA and the federal agencies. Certainly, it has applicability to critical infrastructures, but we think that it also has applicability across the board to anyone who's trying to defend an indefensible organization. Um, so starting off, what we think we should try to work on very soon is to be able to find what your pets are, be able to discover that indefensible infrastructure. And it may not be obvious at times. These oftentimes they manifest as legacy systems, which are pretty obvious. But there are other ways that you can potentially find pets. And I have another talk on the DIE triad that you can also look at from last year as well as this coming year, as well as this conference this year, that will help you understand how to discover your pets. Once you have an understanding of your pets, you got to make sure you have veterinarians to cover those pets. As Josh mentioned, Bob Rudis found all these exchange servers that really had no veterinarians taking care of those pets, and so they were running amok. They were getting infected. They were creating other issues that will come back and haunt those companies that don't have proper care for those pets. Then within the next 3 months, we recommend that you start looking at ways that you can promote the DIE principles ahead of the CIA principles. And what's really interesting actually about the DIE principles is that they happen to be actually very business aligned. The business wants agility. They don't want to be burdened by having all these pets. And so you'll find, as Josh mentioned earlier, you'll find great partnership with the CIO. You'll find great partnership with the lines of businesses that want to remain competitive, that want to drive business agility. CIA actually holds them back in many regards, but it's a necessary component if we can't practice DIE. So what we want to do is have them practice DIE first, okay? And where we fail to DIE, then we need to CIA those things. And then within the next 3 months, as I mentioned, the stack effort was a proof of concept, but we're testing this out to see, find agencies that are willing to give this a try. But I've also tried it with other non-governmental enterprises, and it's starting to show some promise in terms of being able to provide this composite view to understand our opportunities and improve the care of our pets. And then longer term, we want to minimize the number of pets that we have to deal with, and so the indefensible infrastructure that we keep, we want to minimize the creation of new indefensible infrastructure, and so the way I characterize that is it becomes more of a pet control function as opposed to just trying to take care of your pets. Minimize the number of your pets first, as Bob Barker used to say. Don't forget to spade and neuter your pets, right? And that's essentially what we're trying to do here too. And if there's a pet that happens to pass away through natural causes, you don't need to resuscitate that pet or you don't need to reincarnate the pet again to be exactly the same pet. Find the opportunity to instead build towards the IE, shift, try to incentivize the creation of cattle through better IT choices and defensible infrastructure. As Josh said, there's no point in doing the wrong thing better. What we want to do is to help people make the right choice the first time and make that the easiest choice that they can make as well.
Yeah, and if even concurrent with this conference, you can see tremendous efforts from Congress, from the White House, significant pressure to have more trustworthy and reliable digital infrastructure. And if you're in the product making business, Chris Weisopel and I are also talking about the rise of the chief product security officer and how to maybe up level your product and application security programs to be more aligned with some of these DIE principles and other radical changes. So we have an opportunity to change and build back better. Let's embrace it.
Thank you very much.